Hello and welcome to Fundamentals in Ecology, a course that is designed to introduce you to the basic concepts that are central to the field of ecology. My name is Umesh Srinivasan. I work at the Center for Ecological Sciences at the Indian Institute of Science. What we will be looking at today is trying to understand how ecology and how ecologists actually go about tackling questions in this field, going from the scale of the individual to the scale of the ecosystem. So basically, ecology across scales. So what is ecology? And there are many definitions of ecology. The word itself was first used by Ernest Haeckel in 1866, and it comes from the Greek oikos, which means home. And so it's almost like asking, what is the home of an organism? How does this organism live where it does? Why does it live where it is? Why does it not occur where it isn't present? And so one of the definitions of ecology would be it's the scientific study of the distribution and abundance of organisms and the interactions that determine distribution abundance. So all organisms have a distribution, all organisms have a range, a geographical range, and all organisms have an abundance. There's a certain population size that all organisms have, and both the distribution and the abundance of these populations, of these organisms, arise from the fact that organisms are interacting with their environment and they're interacting with each other. And those interactions are what ultimately lead to distributions and patterns in abundance. So the questions that ecologists ask are questions like, where do these organisms occur geographically or in time? How many organisms, how many individuals of that organism occur where they occur, and why do they occur there? So it's the interaction between organisms and their environment, which are abiotic variables. So the environment is characterized by physical or chemical properties which form the abiotic environment of the organism. The abiotic environment being properties like temperature, humidity, availability of nutrients, and so on. And we will get into this in fair detail as we go along in this course. And not only is the organism interacting with its environment, it is also interacting with other organisms. And so those are interactions between species. Those are called biotic interactions. So species might be engaged in competition with each other. They might be competing for the same resources, or one species might be a predator and the other species might be prey. So one species is eating the other species. So those are biotic interactions, and we will get into fair detail into biotic interactions as well over the course of this of fundamentals in ecology. So ecology, in terms of asking and answering questions in ecology, there is a hierarchy in terms of going from an individual organism and then building up to an entire ecosystem. So an individual organism is the basic unit of ecology. Below that unit are units like genetics of that individual organism, or cellular mechanisms that lead to that individual organism. But those are not the kinds of questions that typically ecologists study. So the domain of genes, for example, is about genetics. And if you're going into subcellular and cellular mechanisms, those are fundamental to the processes that we do observe in ecology, but they're not typically questions that ecologists deal with. Typically, ecologists are not asking about DNA. Typically, ecologists are not asking about ATP, for example. The basic unit of investigation in ecology is the individual. And so you could study, for example, the behavior of an individual. Multiple individuals of the same species come together to form a population. So a population, by definition, is multiple individuals of the same species, multiple individuals of that can reproduce with each other and form offspring. So that is what a population is. A set of populations of multiple species, of different species, then forms what is called a community. And so a community is simply the presence and distribution and abundances of multiple populations. So a community is a set of populations, just like a population is a set of individuals. And community ecology is something, population community ecology is something that we are going to explore in fair detail in this course. Now, communities are present or are embedded in a physical and a chemical environment, that they're embedded in an abiotic environment, and that then forms the community along with its environment, then forms an ecosystem. And in the ecosystem, what you have is a set of populations of multiple species with energy and matter flowing through both the abiotic environment as well as through the biomass of species. And so the largest unit at which typically ecologists investigate systems is what is called the ecosystem. Now, when we ask questions in ecology and we aim to answer those questions, we can look at, we can approach these questions in various ways. So, if you look at those questions across that hierarchy of organization in ecology, if you've got individual organisms, at that level you can ask, how are individuals affected by their environment, for example, or how do they affect their environment in turn? So it's not just that individual organisms are being impacted by the abiotic environment in which they are, they're also affecting that abiotic environment, they're also changing their environment. At the population scale, you can ask questions like, why are species present in some places but not in other places? Why does the range of an organism end at this particular point and it's not found beyond that? Why is that the case? Why are species found in some places but not in others? Why are some species very abundant? They have large population sizes, high population densities, but a lot of other species are rare. Why do you see that happening? At the population level, you can also ask, what is population size and how does population size change? Those are questions that people ask at the population level. At the community level, some of the representative examples of the kinds of questions that people ask in ecology are, why are communities composed the way they are? Right? Why do you see that this set of populations of these species co-occurs in space and in time, and some species are abundant, other species are rare, and the community is composed in a particular way in terms of the abundances of different species in the community? Why do we see that kind of pattern? And then what causes changes in community composition? Right? What causes one species to become rare over time and another species to become common? Why does that happen? What is the mechanism underlying those changes? At the ecosystem level, the questions that ecologists ask are, how does energy and matter flow through both the living and the non-living components of this ecosystem? And so you're talking about things like water cycles, biogeochemical cycles, how, for example, is nitrogen cycling through this ecosystem, how is carbon cycling through this ecosystem, in terms of not just how carbon moves through the ecosystem, through the abiotic environment, but also through the bodies of these organisms. There are two ways in which one can approach questions in ecology. And again, we're talking about those hierarchies in these systems. You can ask those questions in two broad ways. One is you can build from the properties at the hierarchical level below that which is of interest. So, for example, if you're asking at the individual level, why is a species found where it is and why is it not found where it is not, you can go to one level below and say, let me look at the physiological properties of this species. Let me look at what range in temperature, for example, can the species tolerate. So we're not actually investigating the question at the level of the individual. We're going one level below the individual and asking, let me look at the properties of the individual. And then if I say, all right, I look at the temperature range in which this species can operate physiologically. So you know that some species are warm adapted, some species are cold adapted. So if I look at a particular species and say, okay, I look at its physiological tolerances and it can only survive between 20 and 25 degrees Celsius, then that is a property of the individual, a property of an individual of that organism that helps me to understand where this species can and cannot be found. At the level of the population, if you're asking a question like, how do population dynamics occur? Why do some populations increase in size, others decrease in size? Why are there cycles in population size where population size grows during some periods and population size decreases over other periods? I can go to the level of the individual and I can say the individual is a set of individuals is what is making up this population. So I can go from the population level to the individual level and I can ask, what is the probability of an individual surviving, or what is the probability of an individual reproducing and creating offspring? That's one level below the population because it's a set of individuals that actually creates the population. And so I can ask, what are the probabilities of things like survival or reproduction or emigration or immigration that actually then affect the way, at the individual level, what are these probabilities that then actually affect the way in which the population behaves? At the level of the community, I can ask, what are the differences in the properties of species that influence whether they coexist or not? Are there species that are very, very similar but do not coexist with each other because they're using the same resource? Or in this community, are there what is the distribution of traits, for example, of species in the community, and can that influence whether the species then actually coexist as part of a community? So that's the way in which you're breaking down the question and you're asking, you have a question at a certain level of complexity or at a certain scale in that hierarchy, but you're asking what are the properties at a level below that scale, what are the building blocks that lead to that scale to try and help answer that question. Or you could directly study the level of interest itself, which is asking, for example, here is an organism, it's found in a certain place, it's not found in a certain place. How broad is its niche? And we will get into concepts of the niche. You can ask, how important at the population level is crowding or density of the population in influencing population dynamics. We will talk more in detail about those things at the population scale as well. And you can ask in terms of the community, how diverse is a community in terms of its species and in terms of their abundances. So you can actually directly measure a community, and you can measure population sizes of species relative to each other in a community that is present at a certain place in a certain time, at that, and you're measuring at that scale itself. What we will be covering in this course are individuals, populations, communities, and ecosystems. So we will be talking about individuals and behavior. What is the role of evolution in determining ecological properties of individuals? How do individuals perceive the world? How is their individual organism of an organism? How does that individual perceive the world? How does that individual access resources and then compete with other individuals of its own species or of other species for resources? How do individuals use habitats? What does habitat use look like? And how important is movement in the lives of organisms? At the level of the individual, we will be looking at interactions between predators and their prey, social behavior, mating systems, and life history theory. At the level of the population, we will look at concepts of population growth that are density independent, which means that the number of organisms, number of individuals in the population has no bearing on how the population actually grows. That's density independent population growth. We will look at concepts in density dependent population growth, which is basically saying, actually, if you increase the number of individuals in the population is likely to grow slower or not grow at all if you have too many individuals in the population already. We will look at Lotka-Volterra competition models, which are very, very fundamental to our understanding of populations, and we will look at Lotka-Volterra predator-prey models, and look at populations that are linked to each other, multiple populations that are linked to each other through the movement of individuals from one population to the other, and those are called metapopulations. At the level of the community, we will try to understand how conditions and resources, conditions such as temperature, humidity, carbon dioxide concentration, versus resources such as food or nesting sites. How do conditions and resources influence communities? We will get into the concept of the niche and the fundamental and the realized niche. How communities are distributed across space and time, how communities are assembled in terms of what are the various kinds of ways in which multiple species can actually come together to form a community, and how do the population sizes of those communities differ within a community. We will look at species interactions like competition, facilitation, predation, various kinds of interactions that species have with each other, and how that leads to properties of communities. Species diversity and how we measure species diversity. And then at very, very broad spatial scales, macroecology and biogeography, which is the study of how species are actually distributed over large spatial scales on planet Earth. At the level of the ecosystem, we will get into biogeochemical cycles, things like the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle, the water cycle, and then also talk about ecosystem stability in terms of how do ecosystems remain stable over large periods of time, and what are the mechanisms underlying the ways in which an ecosystem might actually tip, it might actually change from being one kind of ecosystem to another. So you could ask a question like, what are the mechanisms underlying how a forest might become, a forest ecosystem might become a grassland ecosystem, or vice versa. So that is the outline, the broad outline of how this course is going to be structured. Welcome to Fundamentals in Ecology, and next time what we will be talking about is the role of evolution in influencing the ecological properties of species. So see you next session.